And before we get into this video, I swear I'm not copying this guy right here. I've had this John made for like a couple months and I decided to whip it out of the back at this time. I just ranked the top 10 most underrated bosses in the Soul series, so I thought it was only fair that I followed that up with the top 10 most overrated bosses in the Soul series. Also a shameless plug to that video. And now I'm hopping right into business with how I'm going to rank this. Firstly, I'm going to rank these bosses on how good I think they are. Obviously, things of that nature. That's always how we rank bosses. But I'm also going to take into account a little bit of difficulty. If everyone says how hard this boss is, and I really don't think it's that hard, that alone could be enough for me to put this boss in the honorable mentions, or maybe even in the tier list, or ranking, whatever you want to call it. Also, I just want to put this out there so I don't get any hate comments. A lot of the bosses in this video are going to be really good or just really well thought of bosses. So just because I put one in the overrated category does not mean it's a bad boss. It doesn't mean I think it's a bad boss. I just think it gets a little bit too much glaze. And I just wanted to say this because I definitely have some hot takes that I'm going to tell you later in this video. And before we get into the top 10, it's time to do honorable mentions. Coming in the first honorable mention is Ludwig the Holy Blade. And since these are honorable mentions, I'm going to keep them pretty short and pretty sweet. Now, honestly, I really nothing bad at all to say about this boss fight. I just really think it's a little bit too glazed. Obviously, the cutscene's cool and all, has really good music. It's a really cool boss fight, but I don't think it's, like, extraordinarily spectacular, and that's it. That's my whole justification for why this guy's here. And then there's Old King Alonne, which I have a little bit more reasoning for. Now, Old King Alonne is obviously a decent boss, but I feel like the main reason he gets glazed and people say he's good is just because he's in Demon Souls. If you were to put this boss fight in any other Souls game, especially Dark Souls 3 or Elden Ring, he would be a very bad boss. That's because he's super basic, very easy, and all of his attacks are not spectacular. They're just pretty regular, pretty plain, and pretty boring. And then my last hot take is Ishin the Sword Saint, which kind of seems like a crazy take at first, but he is really one of my favorite bosses. I just think his 4 phases kind of drag out a little bit. I think they could have cut down one of those phases in the last 3, or just got rid of the first phase entirely because it's way too easy, and there's not really a point of having it there. And before we get into the actual top 10, I know I'm detouring a lot here, but I would just like to propose the idea of you guys liking or subscribing. Even if you didn't, just watching this video helps a lot, and I appreciate all you guys who are watching. And as always, in the comments, tell me if you have any video ideas, anything I can do better, and what your most overrated bosses are, just any hot takes you have. Or just anything to help increase the algorithm. And with that out of the way, it's time to finally get into the video. And coming in the number 10th place is Radahn. Not Constant Radahn, because that boss is hated a lot. Now, I just love the whole idea of Radahn. It's a giant festival, you get some lore beforehand, you talk to people that you're going to fight with, and you can just summon people to help you with that fight. It's a cool arena. I love how he comes down on a Midir in his second phase. All of his attacks look very cool, but in terms of gameplay-wise, it just doesn't really feel that fun to fight. Like, his attacks don't really just, feel that fun to dodge and try to figure out how to telegraph it and shit like that. And, while you're playing, you don't really think that's a big difference, but in hindsight, that's, where most of the fun of the fight comes out. I still think this is a very fun fight, but there's so many other bosses in Elden Ring that I think deserve to be ranked ahead of him and aren't because people glaze this guy a little bit too much. Now, coming in the 9th spot is Ivory King from the Dark Souls 2 final DLC, final boss of the final DLC. It's a really cool fight in hindsight. I mean, it's a really cool fight just in general. You fall down this giant pit along some knights that you went throughout the entire DLC collecting to help you fight this battle. Then you fight a shit ton of the soldiers with the knights while the knights sacrifice themselves to block the portals. That way it's just you and the boss at the end. And just with what I've said, we already have a problem. Now, this experience of what I just said is really cool. It's really fun. But if you have to do it every single time you want to fight this guy, it gets super repetitive and super annoying. Especially because this boss fight is pretty fucking hard. And once you actually start fighting this guy, it's really cool. The arena is obviously really cool. The boss looks really cool. His attacks look super cool. But he literally has 2 attacks. I've fought this guy around maybe 8 different times because I played a lot of DS2. And he literally spams the same 2 attacks every time. Almost every single one of my fights against him, he's only ever used those 2 attacks. Which obviously, it's still a kind of fun fight because those attacks are pretty cool. But it just gets a little bit repetitive and a little bit boring. And I honestly think this boss fight could have benefited it and just became so much better by just adding a couple more different and unique moves. And I do think the primary glaze from this boss fight comes from it being a Dark Souls 2 boss. And obviously, although I love Dark Souls 2, it's one of my favorite games, the bosses in Dark Souls 2 are not so good. So when you see a boss that's very visually appealing and looks pretty cool, you're gonna glaze it a little bit more. And coming in 8th place is the Demon of Hatred from Sekiro, which I don't think is a bad boss. I don't mind this boss fight, but I also really don't love it. Now, a lot of people love this boss fight and argue it's one of the best bosses in the Soul series, and I just flat out disagree with that. It's obviously a really cool looking boss fight. It's obviously very hard, but as I said with Ishin, this fight kind of drags on. A little bit too many phases, and his attacks don't really switch up throughout the phases. There's not much difference, just a lot of extra fighting. And you could also say that this fight's a learning curve, because every single encounter, every single battle, I mean, at least most of them, are teaching you to deflect and to dodge occasionally, and Makiri counter and shit like that. But this boss fight, all you really need to do is dodge. That's all this boss fight's going to be including. So obviously, to an extent, it can become a little bit of a bore, and you don't really have to think and shit like that. But it also is a very hard boss fight, which is why most people, if not almost everybody, loves this fight. And to be fair, he does have a pretty cool moveset, like where he just jumps in the air, fucking slams, does a fire AoE, and just like throws fire attacks at you. That is all pretty cool. So I think the way I was talking earlier made it seem like I didn't like this boss. I do like this boss, but I just think he gets a little too much glaze. And now for 7th place, we're swapping back to Demon Souls, and my boss of choice for Demon Souls is going to be the Penetrator. Now this boss looks really cool. He has a cool weapon, all that shit, and it's a really cool intro cutscene for Demon Souls. As I said before, this boss fight is really nothing special. Just because he's in Demon Souls and is a lot cooler than most of the bosses in Demon Souls, people like to give this guy a lot of glaze. Now, obviously, if he's a decent boss compared to Demon Souls, you're going to want to rank him higher because he's better in that game. And obviously, since this game was made in 2009, you can't really just call a boss bad because it doesn't live up to the extents, or whatever you want to call it, of games like Elden Ring. But I really just do think there's nothing special about his moveset or the way you fight him. And now we're going back to Dark Souls 2, and in hindsight, I would have put this boss a little bit higher on the overrated scale, but now that I've done all the editing and shit like that, he's going to stay here. And the boss I'm going to be talking about is Sir Alonne. Now, he is a pretty cool boss fight. Obviously, he looks really cool, the arena design is really cool, and just the atmosphere and the aroma in the fight is just really cool. It's really cool how he kills himself, if you no-hit him and just shit like that. All that stuff makes this fight really good. But in terms of the moveset, his moveset is kind of like the Ivory King's, where it's like, he kind of repeats the same 3 attacks. He, like, does that dash attack so often. That's really all he does. He has a couple slashes, and then once you get to his second phase, he can do this, like, grab attack where he powers up from you, but that's about it. And if it was just that, this boss fight probably wouldn't be on this list. But it's the run back. And I know the run back really has nothing to do with the boss fight. Like, that's its whole separate thing. I've made the top 10 worst run back videos, and the run back has really no correlation to a boss fight. But if it's a run back this bad, this long, and this hard to make it to the arena, it really takes away the joy from the fight. Like, you don't really want to enjoy this fight. You don't really want to have fun with it. You kind of just want to kill him and get it over with. Because this run back is so fucking bad, bro. I was doing my New Game Plus 4 playthrough, or it might have been just like New Game Plus 2, and I could not for the life of me make it to this arena. I think I died a total of 80 times, and 5 of those times were to him. The run back is so bad, you just cannot really enjoy the fight. And next up is Champion Gundyr from Dark Souls 3. Now, this is obviously a pretty cool fight. I mean, you fight this guy as the tutorial boss, and now you get to go back in time, or whatever the fuck you're doing, and fight him in his prime. He's obviously got a pretty cool moveset, especially in the second phase, where it kicks in, he's just really trying to kill you with those glowing red eyes. But I honestly just think this guy is a little bit too overglazed, just for the fact, well, he's pretty simple. Obviously, he does nothing crazy. He does everything pretty well, but nothing really stands out. And he's just too easy. Like, it would have been so much cooler if you had to fight this guy in his prime and he was just fucking kicking your ass. Now, once again, it does sound like I'm being overly negative, and I really do think this boss does everything well, but nothing really that great, besides maybe his aggressiveness in the second phase can be pretty crazy at times. But besides that, I think he's a pretty good boss for Dark Souls 3, but nothing absolutely crazy. And this is definitely going to be a hot take for my number 5th or 4th spot, whatever it is, and that is going to be Malenia. Now, in hindsight, thinking about it, I should have probably put this boss a little bit, like, in 10th place or honorable mention, because this boss fight is obviously really fun, really unique, and really cool. I just think the overrated aspect comes from the difficulty, and I think the amount of glaze that comes from the difficulty of this boss is absolutely crazy. I like to think of this boss like I do Morgoth the Fell Omen King. These bosses both have very crazy and both very hard to deal with movesets. Malenia obviously is probably a little bit harder and shit like that. But Malenia is a boss fight where you can dictate it. Like, you can control what happens with a lot of builds. Like, you can almost infinitely stun lock this person with so many different builds, it's crazy. But now, obviously, with the moveset and shit like that, it does have a lot of health. It has that regeneration factor and a shit ton of hard attacks. But, like, even with all that, I don't think this boss is as hard as people say it is. So, yeah, in hindsight, and after fighting this boss a couple more times, I really don't think it should have been this far down the list, and that's kind of a miscall on me, so on to the next. And that is kind of going to be a hot take, which is Lady Maria from Bloodborne. Which I know sounds crazy, but I really did need a Bloodborne boss to be on this top 10, and I thought this was the most overrated boss in Bloodborne that I could use. Now, the first thing you can say about it is the difficulty. Obviously, this is not one of your tougher fights, especially for Bloodborne. Firstly, you could parry spam, and even if you don't do that, this fight is pretty easy, but that just doesn't make it bad by any means. I would just say A great boss is usually pretty hard and has lots of stuff that you can learn from it after dying lots of times, which obviously this boss doesn't have because it's not that hard, but it's still a very fun fight. Her first phase is a very simple and very easy one-on-one duel, which is kind of a walk in the park. You kind of just dog walk her. But once it gets to the second phase, that's where this boss definitely steps up in difficulty and in just how cool it is and how fun it is. The whole strategy you had for the first phase goes right out the window, and if you try that here, you're going to get shit on. And obviously that third phase, last-ditch effort for her to kill you is super cool, but honestly, in that third phase, I found I had a lot of pretty shitty hitboxes, which obviously drew down the fun a little bit, but this is obviously still a very fun and very cool boss fight. I just think people glaze this shit a lot. They always say it's the second or third best boss in the game, which I can kind of understand that, but I just don't think it's quite that high. Now, in my opinion, for the second most overrated / glazed boss in the Soul series, which is a take I'm very, very passionate about, I'm giving that spot to the Four Kings from Dark Souls Remastered. And I really don't think this is a good boss fight. I don't really think it's a bad boss fight by any means, but it's just the fact that this boss fight gets glazed a lot. No one really says it's top 5, but they're always putting it top 10, top 8, and I don't really think it's even that high. Firstly, to give you some context, this is one of the 4 main bosses in the game that you have to beat to fight the final boss, which obviously puts some high stakes on it and gives you some pretty high expectations. Secondly, this boss fight is so fucking easy, and that honestly can go both ways. This boss fight literally just depends on your build. If you have a lot of poise and do a lot of damage per second, this is a walk in the park. But if you get staggered between every hit and you don't do as much damage, it's almost impossible. And that's because you're fighting the Four Kings, which is a boss fight where you start off with 1, and once you kill that boss, another one will come in until you've killed all 4, or if you do enough damage fast enough, you only have to kill 3. But the thing is, if you're not doing damage that fast, 2 will come, and then 3 will come, and then you will get gang butt booty raped. Which I honestly don't really mind, but it's the fact that this fight is just a DPS battle. You don't have to dodge any of their attacks. Like, their attacks would honestly be pretty cool if, like, they just amped it up a little, like how often they attack, make it actually do something. But if you're right next to them spamming a weapon, they literally do 0 poison damage and do 0 regular damage, which just gives you the incentive to attack back and forth. And the last down part about this fight is that you have to wear a ring while you're fighting this boss, unless you will sink into the abyss, which honestly is a good thing and a bad thing. I mean, you're fighting in the abyss, which is a really cool fucking thing to do. I don't know, it's just a unique little twist on a boss fight, but it's pretty annoying having only 1 ring available, especially because rings are so overpowered in Dark Souls Remastered. And now it's time for the number 1 most overrated / glazed boss from the Soul series, in my opinion. And while I'm kind of dreading this moment because I know I'm going to get shit on, you guys are going to dislike, report this video, and if you see me in real life, you might slap the shit out of me. And that is because this is a very fucking hot take. I'm on thin ice right now, and this is a Dark Souls 3 boss. I'll give you guys some time to guess it while I just ramble about nonsense. And I'm going to once say again, I do think this is a good boss. I just never understood the amount of glaze and hype that goes behind it. And the boss that I'm saying is the most overrated and glazed in the Soul series is going to be Midir from the Dark Souls 3 DLC. And obviously, I'm going to start with the good things, that way I don't get raped. Firstly, the entrance to this fight is super cool. You fall for so long into this area that it makes it feel like you're entering a whole nother world with this cool-ass dragon. Secondly, I love how you encounter him beforehand. You have like a little mini one-on-one face-off with him. And I also like how he stalks you throughout the entire DLC. That's a pretty cool hidden feature. But honestly, I think most of the glaze from this boss fight comes from how he's the first dragon to do it. Like, he's the first dragon where he doesn't have really shitty cameras, and he's the first dragon that doesn't absolutely suck. Because if I'm being honest right now, till this point in time, this Dark Souls 3 DLC boss fight, every single dragon boss fight has sucked fat ass. The movesets just suck. The camera angles are just horrendous. The hitboxes are pretty annoying. It's pretty annoying to hit the boss. It's just a boring, overall shitty fight until Midir. And Midir is a really good fight. But I just think it's nowhere near, like, the top 3. I might give this boss maybe the 7th best boss in Dark Souls 3, but I just don't think it's anywhere near the top. I think most of the glaze happens just because it's a dragon fight that's done well. And since the Elden Ring DLC came out, and just since Elden Ring came out with fucking Placidux and Bale, they just wiped this guy out of the fucking water. They just look so much cooler. And obviously, Midir looks very cool with his second phase thing, but just, you gotta admit, Placidux and Bale just look so much cooler. Their attacks are so much cooler, and everything about them is better. But I will admit this dragon boss fight does something that no other dragon boss fight does at all, which is make it so you should hit the head of this boss. Obviously, if you go for headshots, I'm pretty sure every dragon, or just every boss in general, takes double the damage. But this boss tries to make sure you go for the head. Like, it's so much easier to attack him in the head. It does so much more damage. It's meant for you to go for the head, which is obviously really unique, really fun, really cool. but I just never understood the amount of glaze this boss fight got. I obviously love this boss fight, but I just don't think it's anywhere near the top 2 or top 3. And that's about it for this video. If you guys liked, please perhaps like and subscribe. And that's it. See you guys in the next one.